All right, this is lecture 11 for Monday, May 11th for History of the French Revolution for Northland College, May of 2020. All right, so the last time I talked about the overthrow of the monarchy, that the crowds stormed the Tuileries and they forced the Legislative Assembly to end the monarchy, and they officially declared a republic. And then they held elections for a constitutional convention that would write a new constitution for France as a republic. And just as a side note, at this point in late 1792, the official law of France was the Constitution of 1791, which had been ratified the year before. And so officially France was under the law of the Constitution of 1791. The Constitutional Convention, I mentioned last time some of the people who were elected, some of the oddballs, and etc. But I want to mention one thing. The Constitutional Convention election was held with universal manhood suffrage, which means every man in France, unless they were a servant in somebody else's household or they were unemployed, could vote. So any man who had a job that wasn't a servant, being a servant, could vote. And by the way, they didn't allow servants to vote because they assumed that a servant was completely under the authority of whoever hired them and whoever house they lived in, so they wouldn't vote independently. But in any case, so you have this, the Constitutional Convention is elected by universal manhood suffrage, and I mentioned that there were two big groups in this new Constitutional Convention. And both of them had sort of come over from the previous Legislative Assembly and were even sort of there in the National Assembly before that. The first group was the Jacobins. They had been, a number of the Jacobins were members of the Legislative Assembly and then the National Assembly. And they had their private club, the Jacobin Club, across the street from the National Assembly. And the Jacobin Club tended to be very radical, right? They had been pushing for a republic for a long time, even under the monarchy. They didn't like the Constitution of 1791 because it wasn't radical enough. They wanted to do all sorts of social programs to generally push a more radical agenda. They were, as I mentioned, a quarter of the Constitutional Convention. And then on the other side, you had the Girondins, led by Brissot, and the Girondins were about 230, 260 members, so they were about twice as big as the Jacobins. And they had essentially, because they were the biggest sort of coherent group, and Brissot was the most prominent member of had been the most prominent member of the Legislative Assembly, they had been basically running the government for quite a while. All right. And then in the middle, there was this group who was undecided. And at this time, I want to point out that you start to get a new set of terms that you'll often come across. And one is the mountain. And what that meant is that in the National Assembly, actually in the manege was a long, narrow oval. It was basically a space for training horses. And it had lots of bleachers on the two sides of the oval and some bleachers on the ends. But it was a long, narrow oval. And the president of the convention, so the space is a big oval, and you've got seats up here, and you've got seats down here, and you've got seats over here, and seats over here. The president would actually stand here at a podium, and whenever anyone wanted to talk, they would come up there and speak at the podium. And when the president looked out, over time in the Constitutional Convention, and before this in the Legislative Assembly, you had people sort of bunching up based on where they stood ideologically. So the people who were the most radical tended to cluster together, and the people who were the most conservative tended to cluster together, and the people who were sort of in the middle were sort of in the middle. And in particular, when the president looked out, when he looked out at the group, generally over here was the most radical members, the Jacobins, etc. And they tended to sit way up in the back. So they would sit way up in the back up here to the president's left. And that's where we get the term, the left in politics is more radical, because the people on the left of the president tended to be more radical than the Constitutional Convention. But in addition, the Jacobins tended to sit up high. They sat in the back rows, the nosebleed seats. And as such, they were called the mountain. And so when you're referring to the Jacobins in the National Assembly, you'll often hear them referred to as the mountain, because they're way up high in the bleachers. The Girondins tended to sit more on the right. And so the more conservatives were on the right in the Constitutional Convention. The president's right, that is. Okay. So you'll often hear the Mountain used interchangeably with the Jacobins. That's because the Jacobins Club is this club that's outside of the Constitutional Convention. The Mountain is that faction of Jacobins who are in the Constitutional Convention. But one thing I want to mention, though, is that the Mountain also attracted some other people. There were some people who got elected to the Constitutional Convention, like Danton, who were not associated with the Jacobin Club. They were associated with the Cordelier Club. They tended to sit with the Jacobins because they had considerable overlap in their political aims. And just as a sort of reminder, the Jacobins were radical, but they tended to be fairly middle class. The Cordelier Club, led by people like Desmoulins and Danton, was more working class, and they were also radical, and in a lot of cases they were indistinguishable in terms of what policies and laws they wanted. But the background is that the Jacobins tended to be a little bit middle class. Robespierre, for instance, was a lawyer, and Danton and Desmoulins were, well, Desmoulins had been a member of the Grub Street Enlightenment, right? And Fabre d'Églantine, another Cordelier Club associate, was a member of the Grub Street Enlightenment. So these were poor intellectuals, whereas the Jacobin Club was more lawyers and such. But they were both radical. And you can make of what you will out of that in terms of Marxism. Like, you know, the Jacobins clearly in the Marxist schema represent the working class of Paris, but they're middle class, right? How do you reconcile that? And we'll see later there's even some splits there. But for the meantime, one of the things that you start to see is that because, especially the Cordelier Club was really closely aligned with the sections and the sans-culottes, the working class people of Paris, and the Cordelier Club was good at organizing the sections and the working class peoples of Paris to march on things. You know, they were key in overthrowing this Paris city government on August 10th, and then getting the march on the Tuileries to oust Louis XVI. The Cordelier Club was key with that. And the Jacobins, because they were closely aligned with the Cordelier Club, could use the power of street demonstrations. Everybody knew that if they were having an argument in the National Assembly or Constitutional Assembly Convention, that if push came to shove, the Jacobins could call up a street demonstration because they could call on the Cordelier Club and they could call on the sections. And so what you start to see happening here is that you get this outside, this Jacobin Girondin split, or the Mountain versus the Girondin split in the Constitutional Convention, always has this threat of violence on the outside of it, because everybody knows the Jacobins can call up help from the streets of Paris, the sans-culottes, etc. And so the Girondins are increasingly worried about the Mountain, the Jacobins, the Cordelier Club members, because they seem to be violent and radical, right? And so as soon as the Constitutional Convention sits, the Girondins, being the biggest bloc, are sort of the leaders, and they have the most clout. They can get what they want pushed through the assembly. They sort of are running the government, but they're constantly afraid that these radicals, the Mountain up there in the high nosebleed seats, are going to call up the sans-culottes, and there's going to be street violence, right? And so this is the tension that's going on here, and the Jacobins and the Cordelier Club have a pretty big agenda that they want to enact. And again, I want to point back to the fact that I talked about these tensions that came out in these years, 1791, and one of the tensions was that the sort of middle class, the Girondin vision, and before that the Feuillants vision of the revolution was that they would create equal rights before the law, but they had no intention of creating economic equality or restructuring the economy or anything like that. But the working class people of Paris, when they showed up in the October days and storming the Bastille, etc., their concerns were often, they wanted control of bread prices, they wanted jobs, they wanted things that would make life better for everybody. They wanted actual equality as an outcome, meaning nobody was poor, right? And so they want real, what we would call economic redistribution or restructuring. And the Jacobins tended to take up that message, and the Cordelier Club certainly took up that message. And the Girondins began to balk at that and say, no, we don't want that, right? We'll give you equality before the law, but we're not going to go around passing laws that are going to redistribute wealth and give poor people money or bread or anything like that, right? So there tends to be something like a Jacobin Sans-Culotte alliance, but we'll see that it's not a perfect alliance. We'll see that down the road a little bit. But one of the first things that comes up for the Constitutional Convention is, what do we do with Louis XVI, right? They got elected because Louis got overthrown. And Louis has been sitting in the temple ever since. He got arrested. He went hit at the Legislative Assembly in August. They put him in the temple, the temple was this fortress up in northeastern Paris. And it's basically a big old prison. And Louis and his family are imprisoned there. But what do we do with him, right? He's a big issue. Now, the Jacobins and the Cordelier Club, they wanted him gone. They wanted to execute the king as a sort of symbolic gesture of killing the old regime to make sure they could never go back, right? But they also wanted to do it to satisfy the sans-culottes and the people in the street who were pretty radical this time and didn't like Louis, right? They just stormed the Tuileries to try to kill him. But if you want to take care of Louis, you've got a lot of questions. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that the Girondins, they were not necessarily Republicans. They were not necessarily monarchists. They were sort of on the fence. They could have been convinced. A lot of them were monarchists. They didn't want to get rid of the monarchy. Some of them were Republicans, but as a party as a whole, they could have gone either way. They could have said, yeah, we like the idea of a monarchy. We're okay with that as long as the Constitution is well written and the king's powers are clearly limited and we have the right king. But they could also go Republican. They were like, yeah, we could see that working also. But the biggest thing for them, though, is that they are thinking about the war, right? France is at war with Russia and Austria here, and then soon with England and Spain and etc. They're thinking about the war, and they're thinking, well, you know, Louis might be a useful bargaining chip, right? We could say to Austria, you sign a peace treaty, we'll hand over Louis, you can have him. So the Girondins were not all that eager to kill Louis. Some of them actually wanted to maybe bring him back as king. Some of them wanted to use him as a bargaining chip, but most of them were not ready to say, let's just kill him. But the Jacobins and the Cordelier Club, the Mountain, they were totally ready to just kill Louis. All right. So the Mountain is pushing hard. The Jacobins and the Cordelier Club pushing hard. We gotta do something about Louis. We have to do something about Louis. And the Girondins are kind of dragging their feet, but they realize they really have to address it. They can't. I mean, Louis is the sort of elephant in the room. You have to deal with it, right? But once you say, what are we going to do about Louis? This raises a whole bunch of questions, right? The biggest one is, what law are you going to try him under? What law did he break? And here it's interesting because before 1789, according to French law, Louis literally couldn't break the law because whatever Louis said was the law. And so whatever Louis did was legal because Louis was the law, right? And so in that sense, there's no way they could charge Louis for anything he did before 1789 because he quite simply was the law. Right? Then you can say, well, 1789 to 1791, it's not clear what's going on. The National Assembly might be the law. The king might be the law. There's no constitution. Right? Then after from 1791 to 1792, there clearly is a law and there's a constitution. But the Constitution of 1791 also said that Louis was sacrosanct and inviolable, which seems to indicate that he's still considered above the law in the Constitution of 1791. So there really nobody could really point to a law that Louis had clearly broken, right? The second big issue, I'll get to that in a minute, the Jacobin position in a minute. But the second big issue is what procedure? How do you try the King of France? Who is the jury? Who is the judge? Who is the prosecution? Who is the defense? And these were serious questions because they wanted it, whatever happened, everybody wanted it to look legitimate. They didn't want someone to think that somebody had just put Louis on trial as a private, on their own and killed him, and that wasn't what was supposed to happen. Everybody wanted this to look legitimate, so everybody needed to have a good process. But both the Girondins and the Mountain are saying, well, we think this process is best, but that process favors the outcome they want. Everybody knows that if you put him on trial with the whole population of France, he might be acquitted. If you put him on trial in the convention, he might be convicted, he might not. If you had a special jury trial of the people of Paris, he'd definitely be convicted, right? So everybody's arguing about what process to use. And ultimately, here's where you start to see Robespierre emerge as a real leader of the Jacobins. Both Robespierre and there's another guy who shows up. I mean, I'll write Robespierre's name up here. Robespierre is an interesting guy. Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer from Arras, which is in northern France. Before this, he was famous for, he wore kind of old-fashioned clothes, and he rented a room with an artisan family in Paris, a really small room. He didn't have any kind of luxury whatsoever. He was known as a very sort of Spartan, ascetic guy. Didn't do anything fun. He was totally about morality, and he had rigid principles. And he spoke in a kind of a high, whiny voice, but he spoke about morality all the time in the Constitutional Convention, and he was seen as utterly incorruptible. Everyone, even the people who hated him, agreed that he was totally sincere and honest. He was not in it for power or glory or fame. He honestly wanted what he thought was right. But he was also kind of seen as rigid and strange, right? But he had a lot of clout because he so obviously had integrity. And the things that he said resonated well with the Jacobin Club and with the Sans-Culottes, and so he had sort of an alliance with people like Danton and Desmoulins, but he didn't really like Danton and Desmoulins. Danton was, he was also, I think he'd been trained as a lawyer, don't quote me on that, but Danton was a larger-than-life guy. He was a fantastic orator. He was a big guy. He just filled a room with his presence. He was sort of larger than life. And he loved to drink, and he loved fine food, and he loved parties, and he was just the sort of guy who was just huge, his huge personality. And he and Robespierre just didn't hit it off, because Danton was all about the flashy gesture and the big, and rousing the crowd and getting the emotion going, and Robespierre was always talking about what was moral and just. Right? But both of them are in the convention, and they basically have an alliance here because they realize that their politics are very similar, but they're very different personalities, so they have an uneasy alliance. One of Robespierre's closest associates was a guy named Saint-Just, who was kind of interesting. He was also a brilliant orator, but he was a young guy. He's like 21 years old. And he had become a politician, gotten elected solely on his ability to give fantastic speeches. And Saint-Just was a really smart guy, had read a lot of his Rousseau and things like that, so he was fantastic for bringing up, political ideology and Enlightenment thought and whipping it into a really great speech. And he and Robespierre and Saint-Just sort of saw things eye to eye. Saint-Just was a little more bloodthirsty than Robespierre. Saint-Just was kind of wanted something exciting to happen, right? But now, when they're debating these questions in the king, Robespierre and Saint-Just make an interesting argument. They argue essentially that they follow Rousseau, they bring up Rousseau, and they say, all government gets its power from the people. And so Louis XVI, because he was the government, got his power from the people, and ultimately the people are the ones to judge Louis. Right? And what's interesting is that they then went one step further. And they actually said, we don't have to put Louis on trial. On August 10th, the people of Paris stormed the Tuileries to overthrow Louis. That's the trial. That was the judgment. The people have decided Louis should be overthrown. And therefore, the question now before the convention is not whether to put Louis on trial. He's already been put on trial and convicted by the people. The question is just, what's his punishment? Right? Later, Saint-Just would make an even more interesting argument. He would argue that all kings are tyrants and they belong not to the people, and therefore Louis was never even a member of the nation of France. He was an outsider, an alien tyrant imposing his will on the people, and therefore the people of France could kill him not as a traitor because he wasn't even a part of the group, and not as the government because he wasn't ever the legitimate government, but as an outside alien force that was an enemy of the nation. So they could just kill him because he was an enemy of the nation outside the nation. So Robespierre and Saint-Just both were taking a pretty radical position. But what's kind of interesting is the Girondins, initially there were about 230 people who were really closely aligned with the Girondins. There was like 130 some for the mountain. So the Girondins could really do what they wanted. And they had a lot of prestige. They had been running the government before that, under the old Legislative Assembly. But the Girondins really started to get kind of scared of the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobins, and they began to overreact. They began to sort of fight the Jacobins, and instead of ignoring them, they tended to get defensive and fight back. And this actually began to convince people in the middle, the so-called plain, because they're not the mountain, the plain began to convince the people that maybe the Girondins were like in it for the power or something, because the Jacobins seem to be totally sincere and they're making their case on principles, and the Girondins are kind of being a little weaselly about it. The Girondins tried a bunch of things that were kind of shady. First of all, they wanted to bring in armed guards to protect the convention against the Sans-Culottes, and given the sort of the way people talked about the people of Paris, that was actually kind of a suspicious thing at that point. Right? It was kind of, the people of Paris had a good reputation, if you will, if nothing else. And so the Girondins seemed to be a little bit too worried about that, so to speak. But second, the Girondins tried to introduce motions to put Marat, Jean-Paul Marat, who was the newspaper publisher, and Robespierre, to accuse them of treason and get them put on trial. And in particular, they introduced a motion to say the September massacres happened because of the rhetoric of Robespierre and Marat, and to try to get them put on trial for the September massacres. Well, that seemed pretty shady to the rest of the plains and to the mountain, and that got voted down, and it actually hurt the Jacobins' stand because the people began to say, well, what are these guys doing? They're just sort of using the law to go after their political enemies. They're not actually working on what's good for the country. Then, remember I mentioned that Louis XVI's cousin was actually in the Constitutional Convention. He had gotten elected. He had taken the name Philippe Égalité, and he was elected. He sat with the mountain. He was a radical. Well, the Girondins went after him too. They claimed that he was a potential usurper of the throne because he was technically in line for the throne, and they tried to get him impeached and thrown out of the Constitutional Convention. For a lot of people, that really seemed like a shady, dirty trick move also. And so the Girondins actually wound up, they came into the Constitutional Convention having a lot of goodwill amongst the uncommitted members of the convention, but they kind of squandered it by fighting with the Jacobins, and they kind of seemed a little defensive and a little too taken up with the Jacobins, and it made other people kind of wonder about if the Girondins were playing on the level or if they had something else they were doing. Well, they argue about the trial, what to do, what law to try them under, what procedure. And finally, the Girondins decide the best way to handle this is they introduce two motions. One, well, actually, I should mention one thing that's going on at this time. They're debating this in the National Convention, or the Constitutional Convention. But while that's happening, the Paris Commune, the city government of Paris, is run by radicals, and they're allied with the Cordelier Club, Danton, Desmoulins, etc. And the city of Paris, because they control the Paris militias and things like that, they actually are the ones who are in charge of the Tuileries after August 10th. They sort of are in charge of security at the Tuileries because it's part of Paris. And the Paris Commune does a thorough search of the Tuileries. And one of the things they find is they find all these papers that Louis XVI had left behind. Lots and lots of papers. And so, and a lot of these papers, just a superficial examination of the papers showed that a lot of them could be potentially treasonous. That Louis was writing letters to heads of other governments and to aristocrats who were abroad, and he clearly seemed to be trying to make deals and hatching conspiracies and plots that would undermine the revolution and hurt the nation of France. So this clearly seemed to be evidence. All right? So the Commune is digging up evidence on Louis. Well, eventually, the Girondins decide to have they form two committees in the convention. The first committee is going to be a committee of people, members of the convention, who are going to go through all this paperwork that Louis had left behind, that the Paris Commune had dug up. And this included, I'm going to read you the list here, 95 boxes, 6 large cartons, 25 briefcases, 34 registers, 7 bundles of papers, and several thousand loose sheets of paper stuffed into sacks. So they're going to plow through all this stuff looking for evidence against Louis. And essentially they're just going to decide if any of it is relevant for Louis's trial and what is relevant. So that's one committee. The second committee was headed by an older guy named Jean-Baptiste Maille. And the Maille committee their job was it was a bunch of lawyers, and their job was to examine all the case law, etc., and come back with a recommendation for how, if there were any laws that Louis could be put on trial under. So they're supposed to examine the legal question. Right? The Maille committee came back first. And by this time we're talking into December, and you know, this drags on into early December. But the Maille Commission comes back in early December and basically says that the first thing that should happen is that the convention, as the legislature, should vote to strip Louis of his constitutional immunity, because under the Constitution of 1791, he is immune from prosecution, essentially. But they argue that the Constitutional Convention can strip him of that if they vote that way. Then they argue that Louis should be put on trial in the convention itself. The convention, as the representative of the people of France, should put Louis on trial. And they would act as the jury. They would vote. Okay? So, while this gets presented by the Maille Committee, a lot of people, conservatives, actually get up and argue against it. Morisson is one deputy. He says that, you know, the king, under the Constitution of 1791, the only penalty spelled out in the Constitution of 1799 for Louis is that he can be forced to abdicate. Well, he was forced to abdicate, so there's no further punishment could possibly be made. And of course, this is when Saint-Just gets up and makes the argument that Louis is actually not even a traitor because he is an enemy of the nation and he should be put to death just as an enemy of the nation. Who needs a trial, right? But cooler heads prevail. And the thing that really tipped it was that while the Maille Commission was making its recommendations, there was another discovery. On November 20th, it's announced that there had been discovered in the Tuileries, the palace, a secret hidden safe in a wall behind a fake panel in the wall, and that this safe contained hundreds of papers that were really sensitive documents. They were correspondence between Louis and the king, the Emperor of Austria, and Louis and other foreign aristocrats. But most importantly, these documents showed that Louis had been paying off members of the Legislative Assembly before and buying their loyalty. This is bribery, right? And this is totally illegal. So finally, in a number of sessions on December 4th through the 6th, after the Maille Commission comes back, they vote they're going to put Louis on trial in the convention, right? And so Louis is going to go on trial in the convention. Now, the first thing they're going to do is Louis has to be given defense attorneys, right? So he's given defense attorneys, and he actually gets defense attorneys. Three guys. Malesherbes was an Enlightenment philosopher, and he had actually been the censor, the government censor, way back in the 1760s and 70s. He's really old now. He's probably in his 80s. But he's really famous. And then two younger members of the convention, Tronchet and Desèze, are going to defend Louis. Okay. On December 10th, a member of the convention reads out an official indictment. It's called an acte enunciatif, an announcing act, against Louis. And it says this. It says, Louis bankrupted the kingdom and then called the Estates General, intending to get them to rubber stamp new taxes to cover up his bankruptcy. Louis tried to use force against the National Assembly. Louis tried to bribe National Assembly members. Louis tried to flee the country. Louis encouraged the Prussians to invade the country. Louis obstructed the functioning of the Legislative Assembly. Louis tried to mass troops at the Tuileries, and thus sparking the August 10th violence. They're actually saying that the August 10th violence happened because Louis brought in the Swiss Guards. And they actually argue that bringing the Swiss Guards to the Tuileries was preparation for a coup attempt, which was probably not true, almost certainly not true. But in the end, overall, Louis is charged with trying to consistently subvert the revolution even while he was pretending to support it. Okay, so that's the charges lodged against him. On December 11th, Louis appears before the convention. He's brought in to hear the charges read against him and to begin preliminary interrogation. And so then there's a period where the lawyers on each side get ready for their accusation and their prosecution and their defense. And the actual trial starts on December 26th. And here, actually I should say that the trial begins before that with the prosecution, but Louis' defense stands up on December 26th. And Desèze is the one who leads this defense. He basically says, his defense is this. He says, Louis cannot be tried under the Constitution of 1791 because there is no provision of the Constitution for putting Louis on trial. He is considered sacrosanct and inviolable. The only penalty mentioned in the Constitution is that he can be forced to abdicate, which he already has. And therefore, he can't be put on trial. In addition, he says, the Constitution says that only 3 things are punishable for the king, and there's only 3 things the king could do which are punishable at all. And those are refusing to swear an oath to the Constitution, although Louis swore the oath, leading an invading army against France. Now, he tried that, but he didn't succeed, so he never did it. And fleeing the kingdom and refusing to return. Well, he tried that too and got caught, so he never actually fled the country. So, according to this, he didn't do any of the 3 things that were specifically spelled out as being punishable, and the only punishment spelled out in the Constitution is to be forced to abdicate anyway. Finally, he made the argument that under the Constitution of 1791, once Louis abdicates or is forced from power, it says he can only be charged with crimes as an individual that he committed after he stopped being king. So according to that, Desèze says, Louis can only be charged with crimes that he's committed since August 10th, and he hasn't committed any crimes since then. Now, what about Robespierre's argument that Louis can be put on trial by the people of France, the general will, Rousseau's general will? Can he be put on trial for having offended the people of France? Well, Desèze actually addresses that. And he makes an interesting point, because Rousseau says that the general will cannot specify a law or an action against any individual. Whatever the general will does has to apply equally to everybody to make it equal. And so basically they can't punish Louis because they won't represent the general will, because it'll be against an individual. The general will can only do something equally to everybody. Finally, or not finally, Desèze then says, according to French law, the convention cannot put Louis on trial and then vote on him because they would be the judge, jury, and judge and jury and prosecution all in one. And that doesn't match French law. That's illegal. They can't do it. And then finally, Desèze goes through the actual indictment count by count. He says, okay, yes, Louis called the Estates General. He did it voluntarily, right? And that was calling the people of Paris, or people of France, to address the issue of the bankruptcy. Louis voluntarily took the oath of the Constitution in 1791, giving up some of his power. He's not a tyrant. Louis, as a constitutional monarch, didn't even have the authority to do the things they said he did, right? And the Swiss Guards of the Tuileries were just defending the king. They were not actually part of a coup attempt. And finally, Louis wasn't even there when the shooting started on August 10th. He was already hiding with the National Assembly, or the Legislative Assembly, when the shooting started, so he didn't even give the order to fire. So Louis didn't do any of the stuff he said. That's the defense, right? The prosecution, of course, makes its case. It makes the case for each of the points in the indictment, and I'm not going to go into that because it's pretty straightforward and pretty obvious. And so on January 14th, the convention decides they're going to have 3 votes. The first one will be, is Louis guilty? Yes or no. The second one was, should they appeal to the people? Meaning, before they do any punishment of Louis, after they voted whether he's guilty or not, should they go and have a national election to have the whole people of France vote on whether Louis is guilty? That's the second one. So should they appeal to the people? And then the third one is, what should Louis' punishment be? Now you'll notice that the first 2 are yes or no questions. The third one is an open-ended question. What should Louis' punishment be? Well, there were 745 delegates to the convention total. 745 people had been elected. But a number of them hadn't even arrived yet, because some of them were from French colonies, like in the Caribbean, and they hadn't even arrived yet. So there were 717 delegates present, 717. On the first vote, is Louis guilty? Yes or no? The answer is 693 vote yes, 0 vote no, and the rest abstain or are missing. Okay, so unanimous vote, he's guilty of something. Right. Should they appeal to the people? Should they ask the people their opinion on Louis' punishment or his conviction or anything like that? 424 voted against appealing to the people, 283 voted for it, and 10 abstained. So that was more split, but still overwhelmingly, they're not going to appeal to the people. The Constitutional Convention is the answer. So now the big question, what happens to Louis? On January 16th and 17th, they vote, and the votes last through the night because they're counting it right there, because this is the big vote. What happens to Louis? Okay, by this point there were 745 delegates. 1 was dead, 1 had died recently. 6 were ill, 2 were absent, 11 were on mission, meaning they were sent off for other business, and 4 abstained. So there were 721 votes on the night of what should Louis' punishment be. And remember, this question was a little open-ended, so it's kind of interesting. 2 voted for imprisonment in irons. 319 voted for various other punishments that weren't death. Lashes or imprisonment or house imprisonment or a fine or whatever. 13 voted for death with reprieve, meaning that they voted to execute him, but then they were going to pardon him. 26 voted for death with a suspended sentence, meaning that they were going to vote for his death, but they weren't going to carry it out right away because they were going to see if they could use him as a bargaining chip or whatever. And then 361 just said death penalty, period. Well, let's add that up. What that adds, if you count the 26 voted for, let's just say this. 361 voted for death, period. Everybody else voted for something else. That makes the vote 361 to 360. But of the 360 who voted not to kill him, 26 did vote for death with a suspended sentence, which means they did vote to kill him, they just didn't want to carry it out right away. So if you add those up, and they did, you get 387 for death, 334 against it. And so finally, they decided to have one more vote, 1/4 vote, which is, okay, we've convicted him, we've passed a sentence of death. Do we want to actually carry it out, or do you want to give him a reprieve? On this one, 690 voted, 310 for reprieve, 380 against reprieve. So Louis was sentenced to death. And on January 23rd, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution, which is today the Place de Concorde in Paris, which is over by the Louvre. Today there's a carousel there, a merry-go-round. But they brought Louis from the temple in a cart. They brought him to the Place de la Révolution, and he mounted the scaffold. And by all accounts, he was actually very brave and held his composure, etc. But he was beheaded in the guillotine on January 23rd, 1793, and France was now officially without a king. Although monarchists would claim that the second Louis's head left his body, his son, who was still imprisoned in the temple, became Louis XVII of France. In any case, that is the end of the Bourbon dynasty for a while in French history. We'll see they actually come back after the French Revolution, but for now, France is forging ahead without a king.